Good day, everyone. My name is Leif Garinto, and on behalf of my colleague Christian Go, today we are presenting our paper entitled An Exploratory Study on the Linguistic Landscape of Quezon City during the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'll begin. So, ever since the WHO announced the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic last March 2020, governments around the world have adopted measures such as lockdowns, travel bans, and health and safety protocols that pretty much organize the ways people go about their everyday lives. And of course, in the Philippines is no exception. We see these changes reflected in our physical environment, and in particular public spaces, and these spaces have been deterritorialized as a response to this pandemic, and we see this in more particularly in the prevalence of signs that encourage and enforce compliance with health protocols that are set up by the government to control the spread of the virus. And as such, our study explores the science that depicts COVID-19 health and safety protocols in Quezon City, of course here in the Philippines, from 2020 to 2021, and the ways in which language varieties are utilized for various communicative effects. In the Philippines, there are two official languages, English and Filipino, but English is prioritized in the public life or in everyday life, really, as opposed to Filipino, which is usually reserved for limited communicative functions such as everyday discourse and the like. Our study focuses on linguistic landscapes, and this really a study that tackles linguistic landscapes in the city, especially here in the Philippines. And linguistic landscapes, by definition, examines the presence and/or absence of languages in public signs, such as billboards, store signs, restaurants, malls, in a given territory. In the Philippines, while there are scholars who have worked on linguistic landscapes, they are pretty much still sparse, the LL studies in the Philippines. And the two recent studies we have found largely focused on the dominance and functions of English in these public spaces. Speaking of space, we also are interested in looking at space in the study, and mostly because we see space rather as a semiotic construction, especially in this particular context. Quezon City's linguistic landscape, pretty much as I mentioned earlier, underwent a process of authoritarianization that was contingent on social, political, and linguistic activities that was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as such, our study seeks to provide initial findings about how COVID-19 measures are communicated in a variety of public signs in different parts of Quezon City. And while this is not really a newer study in terms of looking at signs in a city in several parts of the world, what is new about the study is the fact that COVID-19 is involved. Or the context of COVID-19 is now involved here. And as far as we know, very little studies, and certainly not in the Philippines, there are very little studies that are done that contextualizes LL within the current event that is a COVID-19 pandemic. So we have two research questions for this study. Number one, what languages are used in the COVID-19 science? And number two, what functions do these languages fulfill in the context of crisis communication? And again, as I have mentioned, our study is pretty much just located within Quezon City instead of a particular establishment because it's just an initial study regarding the role of LL, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we're interested in looking at how parts of a city or this city underwent deterritorialization due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for our methodology, we are again limited to several or not to several images only instead of videos or interviews because of the existing mobility restrictions put up by the Philippine government in response to the pandemic. And it was just a collection of photographs. But the corpus was a total of 113 signs, and most of them were taken in Quezon City. Our study adopted a multimodal orientation in analyzing the signs, and usually when we talk about multimodal orientation in conducting a study in the context of an LL study, you look at the number of linguistic varieties that appear in the signs. But in our study, we also focused on the ways in which these linguistic choices occurred with other semiotic resources, including colors, size, layout, images, and even the construction or material used in the creation of the sign. Our study also noted the placement and social context of the signs, its producer, and its intended and actual audience. And we found initially that number one, the linguistic and visual choices in the signs highlighted again the territorialized nature of the signs in that public space following the COVID-19 pandemic. So now it's secured and it positions its previous occupants, so the officials, citizens, and establishments, in a new, in a new and particular manner or way. And number two, other signs that we have seen convey messages of care. Okay, so that's why we're going to talk about affect later. Messages of care and concern as alternative discourses instead of just simply saying that you're not allowed to do this and these are the protocols regarding COVID-19 pandemic control here in this area. So let's start with discussing the first research question. Top-down and bottom-up signs. So we've made three observations initially with the corpus we have collected for this study. So number one, both English and Filipino are used, and of course English is more dominant and is mostly used on top-down signs. And top-down signs, of course, are signs that are circulated by an official source, and that bottom-down signs, conversely, are created by private commercial actors. So we see the first three figures are examples of top-down signs. So figure one, this is from the Philippine National Police Headquarters in Quezon City. English is used as a means of conveying instruction. And of course, by using English, it presupposes that the reader of the sign knows and is at least conversant in English. So it pretty much highlights the hegemonic status of English in the Philippines. And because again, as I mentioned earlier, the language is not commonly used in everyday transactions. So there's a level of formality here because of the use of English. And we see it again in figure number two. This time is from the Philippine Department of Health. This is from the pamphlet they distributed and posted to enforce and to inform the public regarding the risks of COVID-19 infection. And the code choice, which is English, which is even Filipino rather, utilizes a formal register of Filipino. So even if it is in Filipino, it still uses a formal register. So pretty much like the example of the English sign in figure number one, this pretty much signals that the message is official and indexes the authority of the DOH. For figure number three, which is the last example of the top-down sign, it's now in Taglish. Okay, so of course, Taglish is generally communicated or communicates rather casualness or informality, especially since it's used in spoken discourse or conversational use. But the accompanying textual and visual modalities that are present in the sign, which is from a barangay hall in Quezon City again, pretty much mitigates this typified association or this stereotype regarding Taglish. The visual cues that are used contribute to intersentential code switching because they visually create boundaries between English and Filipino words, and again highlights monolingualism as the ideal mode of communication or route that Filipinos could use in the Philippines. Now, figures 4, 5, and 6 are examples of bottom-up signs, and bottom-up sign. This one is from a health protocol sign in the mall, and its features monolingual. That's its monolingual, so it's in English. Its location is in the mall, and materiality or its material is, of course, it's made of a more durable material than paper, as you can see in figure number 3. It highlights, of course, the mall's compliance, or where you can find this sign, in its compliance to safety rather than active or passive consumption, which positions, of course, the mall as partners of the government to enforce securitization or the security of that public space. For figure number 5, you see it again, another bottom-up sign. This one was placed in a residential area in Quezon City, And the emphatic quality or the relatability of this particular sign is supported by the accompanying visual. So aside from words, the visual is the even more striking here. The use of the coffin and the image of the Grim Reaper communicates the undesirable future that results in one's failure or the resident's failure to follow mask-wearing protocols. And for figure number 6, the sign posted in the barangay hall, it utilizes a combination of intrasentential and intersentential code switching, which again achieves a similar effect as spoken discourse. So it's more casual. So it's as if the poster or the sign rather is just conversing casually to the reader. And of course, since the target audience of this sign is just the citizens of that barangay, it's not as widespread as, say, the mall or the police headquarters. The material use is more temporary than a durable material in particular. Now we move on to number 2, the functions of COVID-19 signs. And thus far, we've seen 4 recurrent functions of COVID-19 signs in Quezon City. So numbers 1 and 2 I've discussed in the first research question, the top-down and bottom-up signs. So number 1 is to instruct the public about health and safety protocols. And number 2, visual resources are utilized to convey health guidelines. So for this part, I want to focus on the last two, expressions of affect and informational function. So for expressions of affect rather, establishments utilize discursive strategies that elicit feelings of comfort and reassurance for their patrons. And for the informational function, signs communicate relevant information about COVID-19 and protocols to its readers. So for affect, we see it in figure number 7, which again is a sign that you can see in a pharmacy in Quezon City. It provides a caring message to its clients. Instead of simply saying that these are the rules, the protocols you have to follow, there is a caring sentiment and relatability to its patrons or readers or clients. In addition, of course, to emphasizing the measures that the store is taking to ensure safe transaction. So it has the message of we're all in this together, we're all in the same boat. So please bear with us because we're also suffering. So you have to follow the rules because we all have to follow it. Is basically what the sign is saying, which of course emphasizes the expressions of affect that I have mentioned earlier. And for the last two, figures 8 and 9, these are both very straightforward signs that basically fulfills the function of informational quality. So the first figure number 8 shows is a sign that shows the symptoms of COVID-19. And because it uses keywords that are predominantly to convey information rather than sentence. So again, just to repeat that, the particular sign uses keywords instead of sentences, and it also uses images that are easy to understand. And for figure number 9, it's just pretty much a schedule of when people can go out to buy their goods, because this was, of course, another protocol that was enacted back then, wherein people were scheduled to go out in particular, and that was pretty much just reflected in this sign. So what do we make of the signs that we have found? So our study hopefully have showed how the pandemic reinforced the hegemonic status of English in the Philippines, as it remains a preferred linguistic variety in crisis communication, both in top-down and bottom-up signs. And while Filipino is used in the corpus as well, it correlates mostly with establishing solidarity or support instead of simply establishing the authority, as is usually commonly used in the English signs. And we also think that by using official languages and embedding them in public signs in rhetoricalizing spaces like in Quezon City, like this one, we can interpret it basically as material manifestations of the Philippine government's measures that they have enacted to contain the spread of COVID-19. And of course, these measures are sometimes very draconian. And finally, okay, in sketching out tendencies in linguistic and visual choices, we hope that this study have illustrated the informational and symbolic role that signs play in the Philippines, not just basically in the COVID-19 pandemic, but of course it's the focus here, and in particular how the government and its citizens continue to confront the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic here in the Philippines. So these are the references that we used, and thank you very much for listening. This concludes our presentation.